The gunshot tore through the darkness, hot and final. Thomas Blackwood's eyes snapped open. He was in his bed, but his body was on a battlefield miles and years away. Sweat drenched his nightshirt, cold and slick. His heart was a drum beating a frantic retreat against his ribs. His hand, old and scarred, shot under his pillow. Fingers, crooked with age but sure with memory, found the cold steel of the Colt revolver. He gripped it tight, a lifeline to a world that no longer existed. His eyes scanned the cabin. Shadows danced in the corners, thrown by the weak moonlight filtering through the grimy window pane. But there were no intruders, no threat. Just the familiar silence of his self-imposed prison. The only sounds were his own ragged breaths and the lonely cry of a wolf from deep in the Virginia hills. Another nightmare. It was always the same nightmare. For 10 long years, ever since the world ended at Appomattox, the same gunshot had ripped him from his sleep. In his dreams, he was always there, and he was always too late. He released the pistol, the metal already warm from his grip. He ran a trembling hand over his face, tracing the roadmap of scars and wrinkles that told the story of his 60 years. The war was over for the country, but for Sergeant Thomas Blackwood, it would never end. Sleep was gone for the night. He knew that. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the rough floorboards creaking a protest under his weight. He crossed to the window and stared out at his small, lonely homestead. The moon hung low, bathing the clearing in a ghostly silver light. His forge stood silent, a hulking black shape against the stars. Beyond it, an empty field stretched to the dark tree line. He had lived here for 10 years. He still felt like a ghost passing through. The clock on the mantel ticked, each sound a hammer blow, marking time in a world that had left him behind. 4:30 a.m. Might as well start the day. There was nothing left in the night for him but memories and ghosts. Dawn came slow and grudging over the mountains, as if it, too, were reluctant to face the day. By the time the first weak rays of sun touched his forge, Thomas was already at work. The fire was stoked, the iron was hot, and the rhythmic clang of his hammer was the only music in his valley. Clang, clang, clang. The sound echoed off the hills. Each strike was perfect, controlled. A lifetime of skill poured into a simple task. Today he was making hinges, heavy, ornate things of scrolled iron. No one had ordered them. No one ever ordered anything. The shelves in his forge were lined with his work. Plow blades sharp enough to split a hair, horseshoes of every size, intricate gate latches and simple nails. All of it unsold, all of it gathering dust. He made them anyway. Work kept his hands busy. Busy hands couldn't pour a bottle of whiskey. Busy hands couldn't write letters he knew he would never send. Busy hands didn't shake when he remembered the weight of a dying friend in his arms. A soft nicker came from the stable next to the forge. "Morning to you too, Moses," Thomas grumbled. The old dapple-gray horse was his only company. Moses was almost as old as he was in horse years. Cloudy eyes, a sagging back, but a steady presence. Thomas had rescued him from a glue factory 7 years ago. 2 old relics, keeping each other from falling apart completely. "Weather's turning," he told the horse, glancing at the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "Storm's coming." Moses snorted as if he understood. Thomas almost smiled. Talking to a horse. What would the boys from the 12th Virginia think of their sergeant now? The smile died before it was born. Best not to think about the regiment. Best not to think about the men. Best not to think about Andrew. Thomas shoved the glowing iron back into the heart of the forge and pumped the bellows. The flames roared, leaping up to scorch his face. He didn't flinch. He welcomed the searing heat. Sometimes pain was the only thing that felt real. By noon, the wind was a living thing, whipping through the tall grass and tearing leaves from the trees. Thomas stopped his work to secure the shutters on his cabin. He checked the latch on Moses's stable. The old horse hated storms. He was hammering a loose board on his fence, a fence that enclosed nothing, a fence that needed no repair, when he saw her, Martha Wilson. She was marching up the path from her property, her back ramrod straight, 70 years old, and she still moved like she was leading a charge. "Storm's coming, Martha," he called out. "Shouldn't be out." I know when a storm's coming better than you do. Thomas Blackwood, she hollered back. Her voice was sharp, but there was no malice in it. Been feeling it in my knees since yesterday. Martha was the widow of a Confederate captain. When Thomas, a former Union sergeant, had bought this land after the war, he'd expected nothing but hatred from her, but Martha's grudges were her own, and for some reason, he'd never been on her list. She held out a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Brought you this. Made too much bread. It was the same excuse she used every week. They both knew she baked it just for him, and they both pretended not to. Obliged, Thomas said, taking the heavy basket. He could see the stiffness in her fingers, the pain in her joints. The years had been cruel to them both. You hear about them Pinkertons in town? She asked, her gray eyes sharp. Thomas shook his head. He avoided town. He avoided people. Looking for a woman and a child, she said, her voice dropping. Runaway wife, they say. Offering a big reward. Not our business, Thomas said, turning back to his fence. Could be somebody in trouble, Martha pressed. Always somebody in trouble, Martha. The old woman looked at him, her face a mask. There was a time when that would have mattered to you. Thomas slammed the nail into the post with a single, violent blow. That time's long past. Martha sighed, a small sound of disappointment. Storm's going to be a bad one. Make sure that roof of yours is tight. She turned to leave, then paused. The war's been over a long time, Thomas. Not everyone's still fighting it. He watched her walk away straight and proud. Martha had lost a husband and 2 sons in the war, but somehow she had found a way to go on living. Thomas had only lost himself, and that felt like a heavier burden than he could bear. The first fat drops of rain began to fall. Thunder rumbled, a low, angry growl in the distance. He gathered his tools and headed for the shelter of the forge. The air was thick, heavy with electricity. This storm was going to be worse than he thought. Inside, he banked the forge fire, ensuring the embers would last the night. The smell of hot metal and coal smoke was the only comfort he knew. He was arranging his hammers when the sky split open. A flash of lightning, followed by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the very stones of the forge. Thomas flinched. The sound was too much like cannon fire. For a heartbeat, he was back on the field, the air thick with smoke and the screams of dying men. He grabbed the edge of his workbench, his knuckles turning white. He forced himself back to the forge, back to the now. The war is over. Andrew is dead. He was about to douse the last of the flames when he heard it, a sound so faint, so impossible, he thought he'd imagined it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 soft, hesitant taps on the heavy wooden door. He froze. No one ever came to his forge, especially not in a storm like this. Martha had already been. There was no one else. The knocking came again, a little louder this time, still desperate, still afraid. Thomas grabbed a heavy blacksmith's hammer from the bench. Solitude had made him cautious. War had made him paranoid. He unlatched the door and pulled it open, squinting into the driving rain, and his world tilted on its axis. A child stood on his doorstep. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, drenched and shivering. Her dress was torn, her dark hair plastered to her pale face. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart, large, brown, and filled with a fierce determination that had no place in the face of a child. Please, sir, she said, her voice shaking but steady. My mother can't walk any further. Can we sleep here tonight? Only then did he see the second figure, a woman a few feet behind the girl, leaning on a pair of crude crutches. She was painfully thin, her head bowed against the storm. You're trespassing, Thomas said, but the words came out hollow, weak. We can go, the little girl said, not moving an inch. But the rain is very hard, and Mother's leg is paining her something awful. He should have closed the door. He should have sent them away. Strangers were trouble. Strangers brought the outside world crashing in. He had built these walls, both stone and emotional, for a reason. Then lightning flashed again, illuminating the yard in a brilliant, terrifying white. In that instant, the woman looked up. Her head came up, her face turned toward him. Their eyes met, and Thomas Blackwood felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. Those eyes. He knew those eyes. He would know them anywhere. The same deep brown, the same shape, the same defiant spark he'd seen across 1,000 campfires. The same eyes that had stared, empty and lifeless, up at a smoke-filled sky on the worst day of his life. Andrew's eyes. The hammer slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered onto the stone floor. The woman didn't seem to notice his shock. Her gaze dropped again, her focus entirely on staying upright against the wind. "What's your name, girl?" Thomas managed to ask, his throat suddenly bone dry. "Rose, sir," the child said, standing a little taller. "Rose Davis. And this is my mother, Eleanor." Eleanor. The name was a physical blow. Eleanor Miller, Andrew's sister, the one he always talked about, the one whose faded photograph he carried in his Bible, the one Thomas had sworn a solemn oath to find, to protect, if anything ever happened to Andrew. A promise he had failed to keep for 10 long years. "Get your mother," Thomas heard himself say, his voice a stranger's rasp. "Come inside, before you both catch your death." Relief washed over the little girl's face. She turned and helped her mother make the slow, agonizing journey to the forge door. Eleanor moved with such obvious pain, each step a fresh torment. What had happened to her? How in all the world had she ended up here? She passed him at the door, her eyes meeting his for just a second. There was no recognition in them, only the guarded weariness of a person who expected the world to be cruel. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the howl of the storm. Thomas couldn't speak. He just closed the door, shutting out the storm but trapping the tempest inside with him. In the warm glow of the forge, he could see them clearly for the first time. They were starving. It wasn't just travel weariness. It was the gaunt look of long-term hunger. Eleanor's face was sharp with it, her dress hanging off her thin frame. Her left leg was bound in a crude splint made of sticks and torn cloth. "The stable's warmer," Thomas said gruffly, pointing to the adjoining door. "There's clean straw." "We don't want to be a bother," Eleanor said. "Storms set in for the night," Thomas cut her off. "This way." Moses nickered as they entered, his old eyes curious. He was as used to solitude as Thomas, but he seemed untroubled by the visitors. Rose approached the horse, her earlier boldness gone. "He's very big," she whispered. "And very old," Thomas found himself saying. "Like me." A tiny smile flickered across the child's face. It was like a candle being lit in a dark room. It changed everything. He showed them to a pile of clean straw in a dry corner and gave them a thick horse blanket. "It's clean," he said, suddenly feeling ashamed of the humble shelter. "It's perfect," Eleanor breathed, sinking onto the straw. The relief on her face as she took the weight off her injured leg was so profound it was almost painful to watch. "We are grateful, Mr. Blackwood," he supplied. "Thomas Blackwood." She nodded but offered nothing more about herself. He didn't press. The less he knew, the better. Or maybe, the more he suspected, the less he wanted to confirm. "I'll bring some food," he said, turning to leave. He needed to get out of there. He needed to breathe. "You don't have to," Eleanor began. "You're both half-starved," he snapped, harsher than he intended. "I'll bring food." He fled back into the forge and leaned against his workbench, his heart pounding. It couldn't be her. It was impossible. A coincidence too cruel, too perfect to be real. And yet, those eyes. He had failed Andrew. He had broken the most sacred promise of his life. He would not fail these two, not tonight. He ran through the lashing rain to his cabin, his mind a whirlwind. He gathered food mechanically. Martha's bread, a wedge of cheese, the last of a stew. He even found a jar of peaches he'd been saving for a special occasion that had never come. As he worked, his gaze fell on the old Bible on his bedside table. It was open to the same page it had been for 10 years. The paper was stained with something that looked like rust. But it wasn't rust. It was Andrew's blood. He slammed the book shut and turned away. When he returned to the stable, they looked up with a mixture of weariness and wonder. He set the tray down. "It's not much." "It's a feast," Eleanor whispered. Rose reached for a piece of bread, then stopped and gave it to her mother first. The small act of love and sacrifice twisted something in Thomas's gut. "You eat, Rose," Eleanor urged gently. The girl began to eat with a raw, desperate hunger that made Thomas look away. How long had it been? Days? Weeks? There's plenty, he said gruffly. Don't make yourselves sick. He watched them eat in silence. He watched the way Eleanor made sure Rose had the best pieces, the way the child savored every single bite. The questions could wait. For tonight, they were just two souls seeking shelter from the storm. I'll be in the cabin, he said when they were done. The forge fire will keep it warm in here. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood, Eleanor said, looking him straight in the eye. The resemblance to Andrew was a fresh wound. The same high cheekbones, the same stubborn set to the jaw. He had to get out of there. Get some rest, he muttered, and left. Back in his cabin, the storm raged on. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the closed Bible. He had opened it 1,000 times, read the passage Andrew had been reading just before the end. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Faith. What good was faith when you were watching your best friend bleed out in your arms? What good was a promise when the world fell apart before you could keep it? Find Eleanor. Take care of her. She has no one else. He had tried. For 2 years after the war, he had searched. He wrote letters. He traveled. But it was like looking for a single leaf in a hurricane. The South was in ruins. People were scattered. Eleanor Miller had simply vanished. Eventually, he had given up. He had retreated here, to this forge, to this valley, to this silence. He had tried to bury the past, and now the past had knocked on his door. The thunder rolled, and it sounded just like cannon fire. Thomas was up before the sun, the forge fire already roaring back to life. He hadn't slept. How could he? His carefully constructed world of solitude and routine had been shattered. He worked automatically, the familiar motions of the hammer a comfort. Heat, strike, quench, repeat. The rhythm cleared his mind, or at least it was supposed to. Today it did nothing. His thoughts were a tangled mess of Eleanor and Rose. Should he tell her? Should he admit who he was? That he'd known her brother? That he'd made a promise he couldn't keep? How do you look at a ghost reflection and confess your failure? Good morning, sir. Thomas spun around. Rose stood in the doorway, her hair a mess from sleep, but her eyes sharp and curious. Your mother? He asked. Still sleeping. The walking hurts her, something fierce. Thomas turned back to his work. The hammer blows suddenly louder, more forceful. No need to call me sir. Blackwood will do. The little girl crept further into the forge, her eyes wide as she took in the tools, the glowing coals, the finished pieces on the shelves. Did you make all these? Over the years, she ran a small finger along the curve of a candlestick. They're awful pretty, like drawings made of metal. He felt a strange flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. Can I watch you? She asked. He hesitated. A forge was no place for a child, but there was something about this girl, something steady and old in her eyes. He found himself nodding. Stay back from the fire, and don't touch anything. She perched on a stool a safe distance away, watching with rapt attention. For a long time, the only sound was the clang of the hammer. Why do you talk to your horse? Rose asked suddenly. Thomas stopped mid-swing. What? Last night. I heard you talking to Moses. Does he understand you? Thomas set his hammer down. Probably understands me better than most people. I talk to animals too, she confided. Mother says it's because I don't have other children to play with, but I think animals listen better. There was something so direct about her, so disarming. He found himself answering honestly. Moses and I have an understanding. He doesn't ask questions I can't answer. A small giggle escaped her. It was a sound so out of place in the grim forge that it was like a splash of color in a black and white world. The connecting door opened and Eleanor appeared on her crutches. She looked alarmed to see Rose in the forge, but relaxed when she saw her daughter was safe. I'm sorry, she said to Thomas. She shouldn't be bothering you. She's no bother, he said, feeling awkward under Eleanor's gaze. In the morning light, the resemblance to Andrew was a punch to the gut. Eleanor studied him, her expression guarded. We've imposed long enough, Mr. Blackwood. We should be on our way. Your leg, Thomas said, turning back to his work so he wouldn't have to look at her. You should rest it another day. We've already taken advantage. It's no advantage, he interrupted. Stay until you're fit to travel. He could feel her eyes on him, questioning his motives. A lone man offering shelter to a woman and child. In these times, it was a reason for suspicion, not gratitude. "We can't pay you," she said finally. "Not asking for payment." "Then why help us?" He set the hammer down again and turned to face her. What could he say? "Because I owe a debt to your dead brother? Because your eyes are a constant reminder of my greatest failure?" "Storm's coming back tonight," he said instead, gesturing to the window. The clouds were already gathering again. "Wouldn't send a dog out in that." She seemed to weigh his words, searching his face. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. She gave a slow, reluctant nod. "One more night, then. But we won't be idle. Rose can help with chores. I can mend clothes." "No need." "Please," she insisted, a flash of pride in her eyes. "We pay our way, Mr. Blackwood. However we can." He saw it then. The same stubborn dignity Andrew had possessed. He gave a single nod. "As you wish." The morning passed in a strange, quiet truce. Thomas worked. Rose watched, asking sharp, intelligent questions. At noon, he made a simple bean soup, and they ate together in the stable, a makeshift family thrown together by a storm. After they ate, Eleanor insisted on washing the bowls at the pump outside. He watched her struggle, her movements slow but determined. "Mother hurt her leg when we left home," Rose said quietly, appearing at his side. Thomas looked down at the child. Her face was serious, her voice low. "She says it was an accident, but I heard them fighting that night. Him and Mother." "Him? My father," the girl whispered. "He gets mean when he drinks." A cold knot formed in Thomas's stomach. He looked back at Eleanor, and for the first time, he noticed the faded yellow bruise high on her cheekbone, mostly hidden by her hair. "Is he looking for you?" he asked carefully. Rose's eyes went wide with terror. "You won't tell him where we are, will you? Please, Mr. Blackwood." "No," he said quickly, his voice firm. "No, I won't tell anyone. I promise." The child relaxed, but only a little. "Mother says we're going north, where people are kinder. A man she would risk all this to escape. A man who put bruises on her face and broke her leg. A man who made his own daughter terrified of his name. Father was a soldier in the war," Rose added, as if it explained everything. "Mother says it changed him." It had changed them all, Thomas thought. When Eleanor returned, Rose fell silent. Thomas took the clean bowls, his expression carefully neutral. "I should check those splints," he said, nodding at Eleanor's leg. "Make sure they're holding." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "They're fine." "With respect, ma'am, they look like they were done in a hurry. I set my share of broken bones during the war. I might be able to make you more comfortable." Something flickered in her eyes at the mention of the war. After a long moment, she gave a stiff nod. She sent Rose to give Moses an apple from her bag, a clear dismissal. Once they were alone, Eleanor looked him straight in the eye. "Which side did you fight for, Mr. Blackwood?" The question was blunt. A test. "Does it matter?" "In these parts," she said quietly, "it might." "Union," he admitted. 12th Virginia Volunteers." Her expression didn't change. "My husband was Confederate, 3rd Virginia Cavalry." A warning, or just a fact? He couldn't tell. "The war is long over, Mrs. Davis." "Not for some," she replied. "Not for men like my husband." There was a world of pain in that sentence. He thought of the bruise, of Rose's fear. "Your leg," he said, changing the subject. "How did it happen?" "I fell," she said, looking away. "Down the stairs." The lie was so thin it was transparent. He didn't challenge it. He knelt and gently examined the crude splints. Underneath, her leg was swollen and bruised. He could feel the bone beneath the skin. It was wrong. "This wasn't set properly," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "It's healing crooked." "It's healing," she retorted, a spark of defiance in her voice. "That's enough." He looked up at her, at the stubborn pride that was so much like Andrew's. "It will pain you for the rest of your life if it's not reset." Fear crossed her face. "Reset?" "Break it again," he said, not softening the truth. "Set it straight. It will be painful. But the alternative is a lifetime of pain with every step." "I can't afford a doctor." "I'm not suggesting a doctor." He stood up, giving her space. But I know someone who might help. Martha Wilson, my neighbor. Her husband was Confederate, if that matters to you. She has experience with these things. Why would she help a stranger? Martha, he said, thinking of the formidable old woman, has her own reasons for helping those in need. Eleanor considered it, her eyes searching his. Perhaps tomorrow, she conceded, but I don't want Rose to know. She worries enough already. Thomas nodded. Just then, Rose returned from the stable, her face bright. Moses ate the apple right from my hand. That's wonderful, darling, Eleanor said, her voice instantly warm and loving for her daughter. Thomas watched them, this small, broken family, a mother fleeing a monster, a child who had seen too much, and the ghost of a dead man connecting them all to him. He offered to let Martha look at her leg, and for the first time Eleanor seemed to trust him, just a little. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. He just nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He wasn't doing it out of kindness. He was doing it out of guilt. He was doing it for Andrew. He returned to the forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer, a welcome distraction. But he couldn't escape the sounds from the stable. Rose's happy chatter as she brushed Moses, the low murmur of Eleanor's voice, the sounds of life. They were utterly foreign to him. As the afternoon sky darkened with the promised storm, he saw Eleanor watching him from the stable door. You were right about the weather, she said. He paused in his work. You found me? He corrected her, remembering she'd said he found them. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. Perhaps Providence had a hand in it, then. He didn't reply. He'd stopped believing in Providence on a blood-soaked field in Pennsylvania. Later, he found Rose in the stable, reading to Moses from a small, battered book. What are you reading, child? He asked. She held it up. Poetry. It was my uncle's. He died in the war. His heart stopped. My mother's brother, Rose confirmed. I never met him, but Mother says he was the kindest man she ever knew. Thomas looked at Eleanor. She had gone completely still. What was his name? Thomas asked, though he already knew. He had to hear her say it. Andrew, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising storm. Andrew Miller. The name hung in the air between them, a ghost summoned. Thomas turned and fled the stable without another word. Back in his cabin, his hands shook. The book. It had to be the same one. The book of poetry Andrew had carried through the entire war. The one Thomas had last seen in Andrew's breast pocket, stained dark with his own blood. He'd thought it was lost forever. How did she have it? How was any of this possible? He had given up his search. He had failed his promise. And now, as if guided by an unseen hand, Andrew's sister had found him. This wasn't a second chance. It was a reckoning. That night the storm returned with a vengeance, shaking the small cabin to its foundations. Thomas had brought them supper, and to his surprise they had asked him to eat with them. He sat on a bale of hay in the stable, a stranger in his own home, sharing a meal with the ghosts of his past. It wasn't unpleasant. It was terrifying. He retreated to his cabin, but sleep was impossible. The wind howled like a banshee, and the rain hammered against the roof. He lay on his bed, fully clothed, listening to the fury of the storm and the roar of his own conscience. Find Eleanor. Take care of her. What was he supposed to do now? Confess everything? Tell her he'd held her brother as he died, and then spent 10 years failing to keep his final promise? What comfort could that possibly bring her? And what about her husband? The man Rose called father, a Confederate officer, a man of influence. If he was hunting for them, it wouldn't be long before he came knocking. Thomas's isolated forge would be an obvious place to look. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, over the roar of the wind, he heard a sound, a cry. He sat bolt upright, listening. Silence. He must have imagined it, but something pulled him from his bed, an instinct, a premonition. He pulled on his boots and coat and plunged into the storm. The wind and rain tore at him, but he barely noticed. He pushed open the stable door. The lantern was still burning low. Moses was asleep on his feet. At first glance, Eleanor and Rose were asleep too, huddled together under the blanket. But then he saw it. Rose's small shoulders were shaking. He could hear the faint sound of muffled sobs. The child was crying in her sleep. Eleanor was awake, holding her, whispering soothing words. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mix of apology and worry. Nightmares, she whispered. She has them often. Rose's whimpers grew louder, her small body trembling. No, no, Papa, don't hurt Mother. The words were a knife in Thomas's gut. He knelt beside them, a helpless giant, unsure what to do. Rose, wake up, darling, Eleanor said, shaking her gently. It's just a dream. The girl's eyes flew open, wild and terrified, and then she cried out a name that stopped Thomas's heart cold. Chew Drew, she screamed. Chew Drew, help us! Thomas froze. The breath left his body. Chew Drew. It was a nonsense phrase, something Andrew had picked up out west before the war. A term of endearment he used for those he cared about. A name Thomas hadn't heard in 10 years. A name no one else should know. Eleanor stared at her daughter, utterly baffled. Rose, what did you say? But Rose was awake now, confused and embarrassed. I don't know, she mumbled, burying her face in her mother's side. Eleanor looked up at Thomas, a question in her eyes. She sometimes says things in her sleep. Words I don't recognize. Thomas found his voice. It was a dry, rasping thing. Children have vivid imaginations. Rose peeked out from her mother's embrace. Her eyes, Andrew's eyes, found his in the dim light. There was a man in my dream, she said, her voice hesitant. A soldier, like in Mother's stories. He was trying to help us. It was just a dream, Rose, Eleanor soothed, but her gaze never left Thomas's face. She was searching for something, an answer he didn't have. He had kind eyes, Rose continued, her own eyes growing heavy with sleep. Like yours, Mr. Blackwood. Thomas stood up abruptly. The air in the stable was too thick. He couldn't breathe. Storm's passing, he said, though the rain was still hammering on the roof. Try to get some rest. He turned to leave, but Eleanor's voice stopped him. Mr. Blackwood. Her tone was different now, cautious, suspicious. How did you know we needed help tonight? She asked. What brought you out in the storm? He paused at the door, his back to her. What could he say? That I heard a child's nightmare through the walls of my cabin in the fury of a hurricane? That a ghost whispered her name in my ear? Just checking the roof, he lied, making sure it was holding. It wasn't an answer, and they both knew it. He left without looking back, retreating to his cabin, but there was no escape. A child was dreaming of her dead uncle, and in her dreams, that uncle was sending her to him. The storm outside was dying, but the one inside Thomas Blackwood was just beginning. The next morning the world was washed clean. Thomas moved through his routine like a man in a trance. He made coffee, but didn't taste it. He stared at the forge fire, but felt no warmth. Chew Drew. How did she know that name? Eleanor had said Rose never met Andrew. He died before she was born. So how? Had Eleanor told her stories? Had the name been mentioned? And the child, in her dreaming state, simply repeated it? It had to be a coincidence. But the coincidences were piling up. Eleanor appearing at his door, the poetry book, and now this, a name from the grave, spoken by a child. He went to the stable to feed Moses. Eleanor and Rose were still asleep, huddled together. In the soft morning light, with the lines of fear smoothed from her face, Eleanor looked so much younger, so much like the girl in the photograph Andrew had carried. He had to tell her the truth. But how? How could he add his own failure to the mountain of suffering she was already carrying? Good morning, Mr. Blackwood. He turned. Eleanor was awake, watching him. He offered his arm to help her sit up. It was the first time he'd touched her. She was so fragile, so light. It felt like holding a bird. He brought them coffee and the last of the cornbread. We need to leave, she said, her voice firm despite the pain etched on her face. We've imposed too long. You can't travel on that leg, he said, and then the words came out before he could stop them. I spoke with Martha Wilson. She's willing to look at it. Today. Eleanor's eyes widened. Your neighbor? The one who lost? The one who understands, Thomas finished for her. Her place is just over the ridge. I can take you in the wagon. She looked at Rose, who was now awake and listening intently. After a long moment, she nodded. I would be grateful. He hitched Moses to the old farm wagon, the simple physical task a welcome relief from the turmoil in his head. The journey to Martha's was slow, the road a muddy mess from the storm. Rose sat between them, chattering about the wildflowers, a small, bright spark of innocence in a world of adult fear. Martha was waiting for them on her porch, as if she'd been expecting them all along. She was a no-nonsense woman, her presence as sturdy and unyielding as the hills around them. She took one look at Eleanor's leg, at the drawn look on her face, and her own expression softened just a little. "Well, come inside," she said briskly. "Let's see the damage." She sent Thomas outside with Rose to collect eggs from the chicken coop, a clear sign that what was about to happen was not for a child's eyes, or a man's. As they searched for eggs in the nesting boxes, Rose was uncharacteristically quiet. "Is Mother going to be all right?" she asked, her small face creased with worry. "Martha is a healer," Thomas assured her. "Sometimes helping has to hurt a little first." "Like when Father helped her down the stairs?" Rose asked, her voice barely a whisper. The innocent question was like a physical blow. What had this child seen? What horrors had been normalized in her young life? "No," Thomas said, his voice rough. "Not like that at all." A sharp cry cut through the morning air from inside the cabin, Eleanor's voice tight with agony. Rose gasped and tried to run. Thomas caught her gently. "It's all right," he said, his own heart pounding. "It's the healing part." When Martha finally called them back in, Eleanor was pale as a sheet, her leg freshly bandaged and splinted, but her eyes were clear. And for the first time since she'd arrived, they held a flicker of hope. "The bone's been reset," Martha announced, "but she can't travel. Not for at least 3 weeks." The words hung in the air. 3 weeks. An eternity. They were trapped. "She can stay with me," Martha said, looking directly at Thomas, a challenge in her eyes. "No," Thomas said, surprising himself as much as anyone. "She'll stay at my place. The stable is safe enough. I can watch the road." He had invited them in for one night. Now he was offering them a sanctuary. He was tying his fate to theirs. Martha just nodded, as if she'd known he would say it. The return journey was quiet. Eleanor, exhausted and likely dosed with some of Martha's potent herbal remedies, dozed in the back of the wagon. As they neared his forge, Thomas looked at her, at this woman who was a living piece of his past. "This isn't what I intended," she murmured, as if reading his thoughts. "To be a burden on a stranger." He stopped the wagon. "You're not a burden," he said. He took a breath. "And maybe not as much of a stranger as you think." Her eyes snapped to his, sharp and questioning. "Your brother," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "Andrew. I knew him." The exhaustion vanished from her face, replaced by a stunning raw shock. "You knew Andrew? How?" "During the war," he admitted. "It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a start. We served together." "But you were Union," she said, her mind clearly struggling to piece it together. "He was Confederate." "It's complicated," he said. "A story for another time, when you're stronger." Before she could press him, Rose, who had been listening from the front seat, spoke up. "Is that why you're helping us? Because of him?" Thomas looked at the child, at her old knowing eyes. "Partly," he admitted. "The other part is because you're kind," Rose declared with the simple, unshakable certainty of a child. "Even though you try to hide it." He had no answer for that. As they pulled up to the cabin, Rose suddenly stiffened. She pointed a small, trembling finger down the dark road. "Someone's coming," she whispered, her voice tight with a fear that was all too familiar. "On horseback." Thomas looked. 2 riders moving at a steady, purposeful pace out of the twilight. Not neighbors, not travelers, hunters. "Go," he said to Rose, his voice low and urgent. "Get in the stable with your mother. Don't make a sound." He stepped back into the cabin, grabbed the old colt from under his pillow, and stood on the darkened porch waiting. The riders drew up at the edge of his property. Even in the gloom he could see they were well-dressed, confident. One of them moved his horse forward. "Hello, the house?" the man called out, his voice smooth and educated. "Apologies for the hour. We're looking for a woman and child. My wife and daughter." Thomas stepped into the faint moonlight, the revolver hidden at his side. The man smiled, a cold, predatory thing. My name is Samuel Davis. The woman's name is Eleanor. I believe you've met them. It was him, the husband, the monster from Rose's stories. Haven't seen anyone like that, Thomas lied, his voice flat as iron. Davis's smile tightened. My friend here seems to think you're lying. He's very persuasive. The second rider moved his horse forward, and the moonlight glinted off the rifle held across his saddle. I'm just a blacksmith, Mr. Davis, Thomas said. I keep to myself. A blacksmith who used to be a Union sergeant, Davis countered. I've heard of you, Blackwood, a man with a misplaced sense of honor. My wife is unwell, delusional. She needs my help. It was a good story, plausible, but Thomas had seen the bruises. He had heard the nightmares. If I see them, I'll let the sheriff know, Thomas said, a subtle challenge. The mask of civility dropped from Davis's face. You will tell me where they are, now, or we will search your property, and I assure you, we will not be gentle. This is my land, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a low growl. You're not searching anything. Is that so? Davis sneered. He reached into his coat. For a heart-stopping second, Thomas thought he was going for a gun, but instead he pulled out a folded paper, a reward poster. Perhaps $500 will improve your memory. $500, a fortune. Enough to make any man talk. My memory's fine, Thomas said. Now get off my property. This isn't over, Blackwood, Davis snarled, his eyes burning with hatred. I will find them, and when I do, you will regret this day. They turned their horses and rode off into the night. Thomas stood on the porch, his hand gripping the colt, until the sound of their hoofbeats faded completely. He had bought them time, but not much. He rushed to the stable. Eleanor was awake, her arms wrapped around a terrified Rose. It was him, she whispered. He's staying in town, Thomas said grimly. He'll be back. We have to leave, she said, trying to get up. Tonight. You can't, he said. And they're watching the roads. You stay here, hidden. Tomorrow I'll move you somewhere safer. Where? She cried, her voice breaking. Where can we go that he won't find us? I know people, he said, thinking of Martha. But for tonight, you're safe here. I'll keep watch. He made a promise to her then, a promise to keep her safe, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was the promise he had been born to keep. This was his chance to make things right with Andrew. As he turned to leave, Rose's small voice piped up from the darkness. Uncle Drew used to say that, she whispered, that he'd keep watch while we slept. Thomas and Eleanor both stared at her. Rose, Eleanor said carefully, you never met your uncle. In my dreams, Rose replied simply. He comes when I'm scared. He told me not to worry. He said he sent someone to help us. Her gaze, so clear and direct, shifted to Thomas. I think he meant you. All night, Thomas sat on his porch, the Colt revolver resting on his lap. He didn't sleep. He watched the shadows, listening to the night, his mind replaying the child's words. He said he sent someone to help us. I think he meant you. It was impossible. It was madness. And yet, what if it wasn't? When dawn broke, gray and misty, he knew they had to move. Davis would be back, and not with just one man. He'd come with an army if he had to. He was making a meager breakfast of corn cakes when Rose appeared at his cabin door. Mother's awake, she said. Her leg hurts, but she won't take the medicine. She says she needs to think clearly. Thomas nodded. Smart woman. As he prepared a tray, Rose looked around his sparse cabin. Don't you get lonely? She asked. I'm used to my own company, he said. Mother gets lonely, Rose confided. She cries when she thinks I'm asleep. That's when Uncle Drew comes to me. Thomas froze, the ladle trembling in his hand. Rose, he said carefully. These dreams. What does he say? He told me we'd find help at the forge, she said, her eyes fixed on his. That there was a man there who owed him a promise. The air left his lungs. It was like being punched. That was you, wasn't it? She asked. You promised Uncle Drew something. He couldn't answer. He just grabbed the tray and headed for the stable. He had to get them out of there. Now, he explained the plan. They would go to Martha's. It was more defensible. He helped Eleanor into the back of the wagon, padding it with straw and blankets. "I'm sorry to be such a burden," she murmured. "You're Andrew's sister," he said, the words finally coming out. "That makes you my responsibility." Her eyes burned with unanswered questions, but she knew this wasn't the time. "I will have the full story, Mr. Blackwood." "Thomas," he corrected her gently. "Thomas," she repeated, "and I am Eleanor." He took a back way, a winding, overgrown track through the woods, hoping to avoid Davis. But an hour into the journey, Rose stiffened beside him. "Someone's coming," she whispered. He heard it too. Hoofbeats, coming up fast behind them. He pulled the wagon off the track, behind a thicket of trees. He helped Rose down and told her to stay with her mother, to stay quiet. Then he took his revolver and melted into the woods. He circled around, positioning himself ahead of them on the path. It was Davis and his brother. They were tracking them. Thomas stepped out from behind a tree, feigning surprise. "Mr. Davis, out for a ride?" Davis's face was a thundercloud. "Don't play games with me, Blackwood. I had a very illuminating chat in town this morning. A stable boy saw a woman and child matching their description, leaving with you at dawn." The net was closing. "I'm just checking my snare lines," Thomas bluffed. "Where are they?" Davis demanded, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "Even if I knew," Thomas said, his voice dangerously low, "I wouldn't tell you." "You know," Davis hissed, "I heard stories about your friend, Andrew Miller. They say he was a thief and a traitor, even to his own side. It seems his sister found a man just like him. The insult was meant to provoke him, to make him reckless." But Thomas held his ground. "I know what you did to her," Thomas said flatly. "I know what you did to her leg." Davis's face contorted in a snarl of pure rage. "She is my wife, my property." "Not anymore," Thomas said. That was when Davis's brother raised his rifle and aimed it squarely at Thomas's chest. "Tell us, or die." The standoff was broken by a sudden, terrifying sound from behind them, a loud snap, followed by a crashing noise. Thomas had set a snare line earlier, a heavy deadfall trap for a bear, and someone had just walked right into it. Davis and his brother spun around, distracted. In that split second, Thomas acted. He drew the Colt and fired, not at the men, but at the ground right in front of their horses. The animals screamed and reared, throwing both riders. Thomas didn't wait to see what happened next. He sprinted back to the wagon, leaped onto the seat, and whipped the reins. "Go, Moses, go!" The old horse, startled by the gunshot, found a strength Thomas hadn't seen in years. The wagon lurched forward, crashing through the underbrush, back toward the main path to Martha's. They arrived at a gallop, finding Martha and two other women waiting on the porch, rifles in their hands. "Trouble?" Martha asked, her voice calm as a frozen lake. "It's coming," Thomas gasped. They got Eleanor inside. Martha's friends, Sarah and Rebecca, were widows like her. They were part of a network, an underground railroad for women fleeing men like Davis. They were prepared for a fight. And then they heard it. The hoofbeats. Not two riders this time. At least half a dozen. Thomas looked out the window. Davis and his brother were back, with 4 hired thugs all armed to the teeth. They surrounded the cabin. "It's over, Blackwood!" Davis yelled. "Send out my wife, or we're burning you out." Thomas looked at the women. Their faces were grim, but resolute. He looked at Eleanor lying on the bed, her face a mask of terror. This was it, the last stand. He was about to step onto the porch, to try and negotiate, to buy them time, when the cabin door opened. Rose stepped out. She stood there, a tiny, defiant figure, and faced her father. "Rose, get back inside!" Eleanor screamed. But the child didn't move. She just stared at Samuel Davis, her expression unnervingly calm. "Uncle Drew says you should leave us alone, Father," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the yard. Davis stared, dumbfounded. "What nonsense is this?" "He says you've hurt us enough," Rose continued, her voice taking on a strange, low timbre that wasn't her own. "He told me about Mr. Harrison. He told me what you did to him." Davis's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do," Rose said, her voice now seeming to echo with an ancient authority. "You killed him to get control of Mother's inheritance. You buried him behind the old slave quarters on grandfather's land. And you took his gold watch." Davis staggered back as if he'd been physically struck. Rose took another step forward. "The watch is in your desk drawer, in a red leather box. It has the initials JH engraved on the inside, and a small crack on the crystal, right over the number 7. A dead silence fell over the yard. The hired men looked at each other, then at Davis, their expressions shifting from aggression to confusion, and then to fear. Samuel Davis looked at his daughter, and in his eyes Thomas saw the terror of a man looking at a ghost. He saw the complete and utter certainty of being caught. Without another word, he turned, scrambled onto his horse, and fled. His men, after a moment of shocked hesitation, followed him. They were gone. Just like that. Thomas knelt in front of Rose, his mind reeling. "How did you know that?" he whispered. "The crack on the watch?" Rose just looked at him, her eyes once again those of a little girl. "Uncle Drew showed me," she said simply. "He says the dead see everything. And he says, you kept your promise." Eleanor was at the door, her face a storm of tears and disbelief. She looked from her daughter to Thomas, and finally she understood. The connection, the reason, the promise. Thomas stood up. He walked over to her. For 10 years he had been haunted by the ghost of his friend, crushed by the weight of his failure. But the ghost wasn't one of vengeance. It was one of love, a love so strong it had reached across death itself to protect its own. "Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with a decade of unspoken grief and guilt, "there's so much I have to tell you." She just nodded, her eyes, Andrew's eyes, shining with tears. For the first time, they weren't filled with fear or suspicion. They were filled with hope. Thomas Blackwood had spent 10 years building walls to keep the world out. Now, with the help of a little girl and the ghost of a long-dead friend, he was finally ready to tear them down. He had fought his war, and now, at long last, it was over. If you believe that love is stronger than death and that everyone deserves a second chance, don't forget to like and subscribe, because sometimes the most incredible stories are the ones that are true.